The first category of block level elements that we'll look at includes headings and basic paragraphs. So there are 6 kinds of headings, H1 through H6. And the idea is that H1 is your top level main heading, H2 is a subheading, H3 is a sub-subheading, H4 is a sub-sub-subheading, and so forth. And not very many people use H5 and H6. But the general point is that exactly what you mean by a top-level heading and a second-level heading is unclear. In other words, the exact font and the exact size is not determined by the HTML specification. So different browsers will do different things with H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. The general rule is H1 ought to be a little bit bigger and more bold, or show up more clearly, than H2, and H2 should be a little bigger and show up more clearly than H3, and so forth. So frequently, people use style sheets to give very explicit sizes and fonts to these headings. But nevertheless, it's useful to use them. Even though any paragraph can be made with CSS to be any size and any color, it's still useful to use them because it gives some kind of semantic information. It tells someone who analyzes your page or someone else who comes along and edits your page, in other words, someone on your team, H1 is more important than H2. H2 is more important than H3, and so forth. So it's a good idea to use these headings. However, it's kind of rare to use the really bottom ones, H5 and H6, but H1, H2, and H3 for main headings, second-level headings, and third-level headings are used extensively. The align attribute says whether the text should line up on the left, should line up on the right, or be centered. However, I also want to stress again, CSS is generally preferred when you're giving visual appearance. So rather than giving the align attribute, you can say H1 class equals something or another, and that something or another is a name in your CSS file that gives the alignment. And you can also go into your CSS file and say all H2s should automatically be centered instead of left aligned, and so forth. So you can use the align attribute. It's still sometimes done. You shouldn't feel like it's a sin to do it, but in general, it's more flexible and reusable if you define your formatting, including your alignment, in a CSS file, which we'll cover shortly, rather than explicitly in the HTML. Okay, headings are block-level elements, so they're allowed to contain other block-level elements and inline elements like font tag and hypertext links. However, not the other way around. So you could not put a heading inside a hypertext link, but you could put a hypertext link inside a heading. All right, so here's an example. I have H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. Exactly what the font size is and exactly how bold or visually apparent each of these headings will be depends on your browser and perhaps on your style sheet. But in general, H1 should be bigger and more visually apparent than H2, then H3, then H4, then H5, and then H6. And if you want to do it explicitly with a line, you can say that headings are centered, the default is left, or that they're right aligned. A moderately common page structure is to have the top of the body section, in other words, the part that's displayed to the end user, start with a heading, and then have it be followed by some basic paragraphs, and P defines a basic paragraph. It also has an align attribute, but again, it's often or even usually better to use CSS. So you can say P align equals center, P align equals right, but more often, probably in the majority of cases, you'll say P class equals, and you'll refer to a CSS name from your style sheet file and that CSS name gives the alignment. All right, how do paragraphs work? The first point is most white space is ignored inside a paragraph. In particular, if you have 2 spaces in a row, there's only 1 space in the final rendered output. If you put in a line break, if you put in 2 line breaks, if you put in 3 line breaks in the actual text of the document, those line breaks are ignored. It's as if you had put a space. So if you want a real line break, you have to force it with the BR tag for a line break, BR for break. If you make an empty paragraph, start paragraph, end paragraph, it will yield a blank line. But a surprising behavior is you put 2 of those pairs in a row, you still only get 1 blank line. If you put 3 of those in a row, you still only get 1 blank line, and so forth. So if you want several blank lines in a row in the final output, put multiple BR tags. Now technically, P can be treated as if it were a paragraph separator rather than a paragraph container, and you can leave off the end tags. This approach was used widely in the early versions of HTML, and it's kind of carried over today. But when you're using JavaScript to manipulate the page, it's much better to always include end tags so that the text of your HTML document corresponds very closely to how the browser represents it in memory. So for example, you ought to use lowercase tags for P, and you ought to treat P as if it's a container. It has a start tag and an end tag, and you put the paragraph in between. You have another paragraph, start tag, end tag, and you have the text in between. You have a third paragraph, start tag, end tag, you have the text in between. Now, what's on the right would actually be rendered the same way in browsers. You can treat P in upper or lowercase as if it were a paragraph separator, and you only would have to have 2 in this case. Now, the one on the right is marginally shorter, but only marginally. And doing it the way on the right is just so much easier to understand when you write JavaScript code later that will manipulate the page that is strongly recommended. So use lowercase tags, always include start and end tags. I've said that before, but I want to reiterate it with paragraphs because the early days of HTML tended to do it the way on the right, and people sometimes carry over the behaviors and approaches they used from the early days and don't update them to modern times. Okay, there's also a paragraph type called pre-PRE, which means pre-formatted. And the idea is that line wrapping is turned off. I said with paragraphs, and applies to headings too, that if you have a line break in your actual document, it's the same as if you had put a space. It just gets mashed together in the browser, and where the line breaks actually appear in the browser don't depend on where the line breaks were in the code. It just depends on how big the browser window is. If it's really wide, the lines are long. If it's really narrow, the lines are short. But if you use PRE, then line wrapping is turned off, and a fixed width font is used by the browser. White space is not ignored. If you have 2 spaces, it comes out as 2 spaces. And so because it's using a fixed width font, it's very common to use the PRE tag to give code samples. Examples of JavaScript, examples of Java, examples of Python, and so forth. That's one of the common uses of the pre tag. The problem of that is, suppose you're using it to give code samples, and you're saying, oh, I want to give an example of how to use the if construct in JavaScript. And you give a quick example with a less than sign. Whoopsie. A less than sign means something special in HTML. And so this is going to mess up the browser. It's going to get all confused. It's going to think that you have a tag called B, but with a whole bunch of extra stuff in it. And, half of your actual text is going to disappear when it gets rendered in your browser. And if you run it through a formal HTML validator, it'll mark it as an error. So if you want to display a less than sign to the end user, but not have it treated as a less than sign for HTML code, you have to use some special character entities. So ampersand LT semicolon means draw a less than sign, but don't treat it as part of an HTML tag. Ampersand GT semicolon, LT for less than, GT for greater than, draws a greater than sign. You can draw an ampersand. You can draw a double quote. And non-breaking spaces are quite useful. If you put A space B in a normal paragraph, it may be that the A and B won't appear on the same line, but just by luck, that happens to be where a line break is, depending on the browser width. If you want to make sure that the A and B are together and don't have a line break, or if you want to put 2 spaces and have it come out really 2 spaces, you can use ampersand NBSP semicolon for non-breaking space. You can also use the ISO Latin 1 numeric values rather than the named character entities, but the named character entities account for 90% of the cases where you want special characters.